Imagine losing everything you love in a single day. Children, wealth, health, respect, everything, and yet lying on the ground, covered in ashes, with a wounded body and a shattered soul. A man lifts his eyes to heaven and says, "Blessed be the name of the Lord." This is the story of Job. But what most people don't know is that behind all that suffering, there was a secret never revealed, a deep mystery that goes beyond the losses, the pain, and the unanswered questions. Why did such a righteous man suffer so much? What was God doing in the silence? And what exactly did he say from the midst of the whirlwind? The Bible gives us hints, but the climax only arrives at the end, when the Creator himself breaks the silence and speaks to Job with a voice that shakes the earth and changes everything. The never-revealed secret of Job. What God said to him in the whirlwind is more than a story of endurance. It is a revelation about the character of God, the nature of true faith, and what happens when heaven responds to human suffering. Join us as we dive into the journey of Job, a man who lost everything, faced the silence of God, and still remained faithful. Discover how true faith can endure even when heaven seems silent. In the vast land of Uz, where the days were marked by the scorching sun, and life flourished among fertile fields and abundant pastures, there lived a man unlike any other. His name was Job. He wasn't just an ordinary man with wealth or possessions. Nay, he was someone whose life drew the attention of heaven. Job was blameless, upright, and feared God. He shunned evil as one avoids poison, and his reputation was like a light shining in the moral darkness of his generation. There was no one like him on all the earth, and God himself would later declare it. Job was the father of 10 children, 7 sons and 3 daughters. His children were close, and they often gathered for feasts, celebrations of life and fellowship among siblings. The daughters also participated, and everything was done with abundance, joy, and order. Yet even in these festive moments, Job remained watchful. After each cycle of banquets, he would rise early and offer burnt offerings on behalf of each of his children. He would say to himself, "Perhaps my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts." This constant care reveals the depth of his devotion. His faith was not merely ritual. It was alive, committed, and filled with reverence. Job did not trust in his wealth nor in his own morality. He trusted solely in God and sought to please him even where human eyes could not reach the hearts of his children. Moreover, Job was an extremely prosperous man. He owned 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 female donkeys, and a large number of servants. His estate was vast, his influence extended throughout the region, and many considered him the greatest man of the East. But what truly set Job apart was not the extent of his possessions, but the purity of his heart. He was a man who walked with God. His name was synonymous with integrity. Job's life, from a human perspective, seemed perfect. A united family, constant prosperity, honor, respect, and a faith as solid as a rock. It was the kind of life many dream of, but few ever live. And yet, despite all this abundance, Job was never complacent. He remained reverent, fully aware that everything he had came from God. Nothing seemed out of place. His children lived in peace, his fields yielded without scarcity, his servants worked diligently, and Job's name was revered in Uz. If someone had asked at that time, "Who is the most blessed man on earth?" Many would have answered without hesitation, "Job, the servant of God." However, there was something human eyes could not see. Something was moving beyond the earth, beyond the reach of sight. And that something wasn't an earthly problem, an approaching drought or a common illness. It was a conversation, a gathering in the heights of heaven, a dialogue no man witnessed, but one that would forever change Job's life. For even while Job offered sacrifices with a heart full of zeal for his children, a voice was rising before the throne of God, an accusing voice, a presence that still roams today among those who walk with God, seeking reason to destroy. At that moment, heaven was in motion, and while Job tended his animals, while his children feasted, while he knelt in silent prayer, the heavens were setting the stage for something far greater. Job's faithfulness was about to be tested, not because of wrongdoing, not because of hidden sins, but for something that surpassed all human understanding, a divine test. Job did not know. No man would know, but his life was about to become the center of a celestial dispute. His peaceful days would be interrupted. His dreams would be shattered. His faith would be pushed to its limit. And what was to come wasn't just pain or loss, but a deep revelation, a story that would span centuries and touch generations. The story of the man who feared God, the story of Job, and as we would later discover, the never-revealed secret of Job. What God said to him in the whirlwind would not begin with answers, but with the silence that comes before the storm. But a conversation in heaven was about to change everything Job had ever known. At the very time when Job knelt before God, offering sacrifices for his children with a contrite heart, something grand and invisible was unfolding in the heavens. It was the kind of scene no human eye could witness, but whose consequences would echo on the earth. The Bible reveals that there was a day when the sons of God, celestial beings, came to present themselves before the Lord. And among them came Satan, the one who roams the earth, observing, searching, accusing. The Lord, sovereign and all-knowing, initiated the dialogue, "Where have you come from?" And Satan answered coldly, "From roaming through the earth and walking back and forth on it." It wasn't merely a geographical response. It was an insinuation. He had been observing humanity, looking for faults, measuring intentions. And then God, with full confidence, mentioned a name that resounded between heaven and earth. "Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one on earth like him, blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil." Satan's response was bold, almost sarcastic. "Does Job fear God for nothing? Have you not put a hedge around him and his household and everything he has? You have blessed the work of his hands, so that his flocks and herds are spread throughout the land. But now stretch out your hand and strike everything he has, and he will surely curse you to your face." It was a direct challenge to Job's faithfulness. Satan claimed that Job's faith was bought with blessings, that he was only faithful because everything was going well. It was an accusation not only against Job's integrity, but indirectly against the very character of God, as if the Lord needed to purchase devotion through prosperity. Then God, with authority and wisdom beyond all understanding, allowed the test to take place. "Very well then, Everything he has is in your power, but on the man himself do not lay a finger." With those words, a trial was sealed in heaven that would shake the earth. Satan departed, authorized to touch everything Job owned, his wealth, his servants, even his children. Only his life was to be spared, and so began a battle that could not be seen with the eyes, but would be felt with the whole soul. An invisible challenge with profoundly real consequences. A righteous man would be tested, not for his faults, but for his faithfulness. An innocent man would face losses that could break even the strongest. Satan wasted no time. He descended to the earth with a clear mission, to prove that Job's faith was conditional, and to do that he would use every weapon of human suffering. Nothing would be spared. While Job still slept, perhaps dreaming of his children, of his sheep grazing safely, or the laughter of another family feast, the gears of destiny began to turn in a dark direction. Heaven was silent, but something had shifted, not out of God's cruelty, but because of a greater purpose, a plan that men would not understand immediately. A secret that would only be revealed at the end of a long journey. The never-revealed secret of Job. What God said to him in the whirlwind began there, in the echoes of a heavenly agreement. God trusted Job, and now that trust would be tested like gold refined by fire. And Job, he knew nothing. He still offered sacrifices, still walked with God, still lived with integrity. But a shadow was drawing near. An ordinary day was about to become the darkest day of his life, and so began the greatest trial a righteous man has ever faced. The day began like any other. The sun rose over the hills of Uz, casting a golden light over the fields that belonged to Job. His servants tended the cattle, the sheep grazed peacefully, and Job's children gathered at the home of the oldest brother for yet another banquet. Job, as was his custom, maintained his quiet routine of reverence to God. Perhaps he was already preparing the burnt offerings he would present the next day, as he always did after his children's feasts. Everything seemed in perfect order. But what Job did not know was that this would be the last day of his former life. Suddenly, a servant came running. His face was drenched in sweat, eyes wide, breath broken, all signs that something was terribly wrong. "My lord," he cried, "the oxen were plowing and the donkeys were grazing nearby when the Sabaeans attacked. They took the animals and killed the servants with the sword. I was the only one who escaped to tell you." Before Job could even process those words, another man rushed up, even more desperate. "Fire from God fell from the heavens, Job. It burned up the sheep and the servants with them. They're all dead. I alone escaped to tell you." Job's face was already filled with confusion and pain, but he had no time to react, for a third messenger appeared, trembling, his eyes filled with terror. The Chaldeans formed 3 raiding parties. They swept down on the camels, took them all, and killed the servants. Once again, I alone escaped to tell you. It was as if the earth itself had turned against Job. 3 tragedies, 3 irreversible losses. His wealth, his livelihood, his stability, all in ruins. But it wasn't over yet. The final messenger arrived. He didn't run like the others. He staggered. His face was pale, his eyes full of tears, his voice broken by sobs. He stood before Job, unable to speak for a moment. "Your children," he finally said, his voice trembling. Your children were together at the oldest brother's house. A powerful wind came from the desert. It struck the four corners of the house, and it collapsed on them all. No one survived, my lord. They're all gone. I'm the only one who escaped." Job's world shattered in that moment. Nothing could have prepared him for this. No prayer, no fasting, no sacrifice could soften the weight of that pain. Job had lost everything, his servants, his wealth, his livelihood, and now his children, 10 children, 10 lives that embodied his future, his blessing, his joy. All gone in a single day. The pain didn't come in waves. It came like an avalanche, an unrelenting devastation, a storm that swept away everything. Nothing remained. And Job, the most righteous man on earth, the faithful servant who feared God, he fell to his knees, he tore his robes, a deep symbol of mourning. He placed ashes on his head, plunging into the purest expression of grief and humiliation. But what he did next would astonish both heaven and earth. Job worshipped, yes. In the midst of destruction, he bowed down and worshipped. "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." Job did not curse. He did not complain. He did not accuse God of injustice. His wealth was gone, his servants were gone, his children were gone, but his faith was still there. Wounded, but alive. Yet, in the invisible realm of heaven, Satan watched. The first blow had not broken Job's soul, but the war wasn't over. The storm had barely begun. The full story had yet to unfold, and the shadows were now preparing an even crueler strike. But would Job still hold on to his faith? And for how long? Before we continue, we ask for your support. Subscribe to the channel and leave a like to strengthen us and help us keep spreading these deep stories from the Bible. Now, let's continue with the anguish, the questions, and the never-before-revealed secret of Job. The last messenger had gone. The echo of his words still lingered in the air, as if pain itself continued to speak even after the silence. It was a heavy silence, thick as stone, a void that filled every corner around Job. No voices, no cries, no sounds of servants, no bleating sheep or lowing oxen. Only the wind brushing against the walls of the house, a house now empty of laughter and full of memories. Job remained motionless. His gaze was fixed on the ground, as if the earth might offer some kind of answer. But there was no answer, only dust, ashes, and absence. The absence of his children, the absence of his workers, the absence of the abundance that had once marked every inch of his life. In just a few hours, everything was gone. And with it, something within Job began to break, not his faith but his emotional foundation. He rose slowly, as if carrying the weight of the world on his back. His feet touched the ground unsteadily, as though the earth that had once sustained him had collapsed under the weight of tragedy. With slow, trembling hands, he grasped his tunic and tore it from top to bottom, a sacred sign of mourning, an ancient custom to express what the heart could no longer scream. Then he knelt down. He picked up a handful of ashes from the ground and scattered them over his head. Ashes, the symbol of the end, of what has been burned, of what cannot be restored by human hands. The greatest man of the East was now just a shadow hunched on the ground, cloaked in dust. But it was there. on that cold, dirty ground, amid dried tears and burning memories, that Job did something no one expected. He bowed, not in despair, but in worship. Yes, worship. Job fell to the ground and worshipped God. With a voice choked by pain yet full of reverence, he spoke words that would echo through centuries, marking the soul of all who have ever suffered. Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Job 1:21. It was more than a statement. It was a surrender. Job didn't say it as someone resigned to fate, but as someone who knew that God remained God, even when everything was taken. His faith didn't depend on the presence of blessings, but on the presence of God. This is the kind of faith that scandalizes hell and moves heaven. A faith that demands no explanations. A faith that can still praise when everything else is silent. Job did not complain. He did not question. He did not point a finger at God. He worshipped. And that's why Scripture records, in all this, Job did not sin by charging God with wrongdoing. Job 1:22, in heaven the angels watched in awe. The throne of God received the purest praise, praise born from pain. And the accuser who had bet on Job's collapse now saw a man in ashes, yet still standing on the inside. The never-revealed secret of Job was still hidden, sealed in the heavens. But it had begun to take shape, forged in the fire of trial. It was a secret that couldn't be understood by words alone, but had to be lived in the soul, chapter by chapter. Job didn't know what was happening in heaven. He didn't know about the heavenly council, nor about the challenge that had been issued. All he knew was the pain that burned in his chest and the faith that endured the storm. For any man, this would have been the end. But for Job, it was only the beginning. For although the enemy had failed to break Job's faith through loss, he would not back down. He was determined to go further. If wealth and children weren't enough to bend the righteous man, he would now strike Job's very body. There would be another meeting, another permission, another wound. But Job's suffering was only just beginning. While Job was still lying on the ground, covered in ashes and broken by the losses that had shaken his life, a new scene was unfolding in the heavens. For the second time, the sons of God, celestial beings, presented themselves before the Lord. And once again among them was Satan. God, who knows all things, needed no report. Yet he asked, "Where have you come from?" Satan replied with the same coldness as before, "From roaming through the earth and walking back and forth on it." Then the Lord once again spoke Job's name with pride. "Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one on earth like him, a blameless and upright man who fears God and shuns evil, and he still maintains his integrity, though you incited me against him to ruin him without cause." Satan's response dripped with contempt. Skin for skin. A man will give all he has for his own life. But now stretch out your hand and strike his flesh and bones, and he will surely curse you to your face. It was a new challenge. The enemy acknowledged that Job had passed through the fire of loss and remained faithful. But he believed that if Job's body were afflicted, if he were consumed by physical pain, he would finally curse God. And once again, God allowed it. "Very well, he is in your hands, but you must spare his life. With that permission, Satan came down to earth in fury, and without delay, Job's body became a field of torment. Painful sores broke out across his skin. Open ulcers covered him from head to toe. The itching was unbearable. The wounds became infected, and the stench of diseased flesh spread around him. Job, the most respected man in the East, was now a spectacle of suffering. Too weak to walk, he left the house and sat among the ashes in the ruins of all he had left. He picked up a piece of broken pottery and used it to scrape his wounds, trying to relieve even a sliver of the consuming pain. The scene was devastating. A body destroyed, a heart already shattered, a mind trying to make sense of it all. And in that moment, perhaps the most vulnerable of his life, he heard the voice of the last person he expected, his wife. She approached and, seeing Job's miserable state, could no longer contain her outrage. What she saw wasn't just a suffering man, it was the collapse of everything she believed in. "Are you still holding on to your integrity? Curse God and die." Harsh words, sharp as blades. She didn't speak only in anger. It was the cry of someone who could no longer bear the pain of the one she loved. Perhaps it was despair itself speaking through her. But the blow was cruel. In his greatest moment of need, Job heard not comfort, but a sentence: give up. But even there, amid pain, scorn, and loneliness, Job remained steadfast. "You speak like a foolish woman. Shall we accept good from God and not trouble?" Job 2:10. Job did not curse. He did not rebel. He did not abandon his faith. He knew that his integrity did not depend on blessings. And though his body was in ruins, his soul was still anchored in God. Heaven's eyes were still upon him. The never-revealed secret of Job had yet to be spoken, but every step of his journey brought him closer to God's answer. Job was alive, wounded, but alive, and more than that, faithful. But now suffering would take another form, an invisible one, deep and silent. If his body had already been struck, something even harder to bear was coming: loneliness and judgment. 3. Friends were approaching, not with healing but with accusations. His body was wounded, but now the blow would strike the soul. Job was still there, sitting among the ashes, his body covered with sores and his soul wounded from within. The pain was constant, but the silence around him seemed to amplify the suffering. The wind whistled through the ruins, and the stench of open wounds mingled with the dust of despair. It was hard to recognize in that man the one who had once been the greatest of the East. News of the tragedy had spread, and when it reached the ears of his closest friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, they decided to go to Job. It wasn't a short journey. Each came from a different land with a clear purpose to comfort and encourage their friend in his suffering, but nothing prepared them for what they saw. From afar, as they neared the land of Uz, they spotted a bent figure, cloaked in dust and darkness. For a moment they doubted it was him. The image was so disfigured, so far removed from the man they once knew, that they struggled to believe it was really Job. When they finally recognized him, they couldn't contain their emotion. They cried out with loud voices, tore their robes, in mourning and threw dust on their heads. That pain was not Job's alone, it was theirs too. In the face of such misery, words felt useless. So they chose to do the only thing they could. They sat beside him on the ground and remained. There, 7 days and 7 nights, without saying a single word. It was a heavy silence, full of respect, but also fear. They saw greatness fallen, a life undone, a righteous man destroyed, and they couldn't understand it. No explanation made sense, no argument seemed sufficient. Before the pain that radiated from Job, even comfort felt fragile. During those days, Job didn't move. He scratched his wounds, sometimes gasped in pain. His eyes were fixed on nothing, as if his mind drifted between memories and unanswered questions. Perhaps he remembered his children laughing, his wife beside him, the peace that once filled his home. All of that now felt distant, like a dream that fades upon waking. The silence of the friends wasn't out of disdain. It was the silence of those touched by someone else's agony. But it was also the silence of those beginning to think, and as we'll see later, think too much. They watched Job, judged with their eyes, interpreted with human and limited hearts, and gradually their minds began to form theories about what could have caused such a righteous man to fall so low. For now they said nothing, but they thought a lot. Job, in turn, felt every glance. Even without words, he could sense the weight of their presence. He knew they were friends, but he also knew that silent judgment was beginning to take shape. It was as if his pain was now being observed, analyzed, dissected. In those 7 days, the deepest wound Job carried was no longer on his body. It was in his spirit. Heaven remained silent, his friends mute, God invisible, and Job's soul empty. There were no answers, no comfort, only questions. So many questions. Why, God? What did I do? Why such suffering without cause? The physical pain was excruciating, but the silence, was more cruel. It echoed inside Job like an endless abyss. 7 days, staring into nothingness, trying to understand the unexplainable, waiting for an answer that never came. Until, finally, something changed. On the 8th day, Job broke the silence, and what came from his mouth wasn't a greeting, nor a soft lament. It was a cry of anguish, a release of long-held pain. He did not curse God. He would never do that. But he did curse the day he was born. And now the words began to flow, words from a wounded heart, from a man who still trusted but could no longer contain the agony, until Job finally spoke and broke the silence with a cry of anguish. The silence had been broken, and not with light words, but with a deep cry rising from Job's wounded soul. After 7 days without uttering a single sentence, he opened his mouth, not to defend himself, nor to seek comfort, but to release the weight of a pain overflowing inside. Job's words did not accuse God. They were not blasphemous, but they revealed the agony of someone who no longer saw purpose in his own existence. May the day of my birth perish, and the night it was said, a boy is conceived. It was a cry for erasure. Job didn't just wish to die. He wished he had never existed. He wanted the day of his birth wiped from the calendar, that the night when his life began in the womb had never happened. This was not the voice of a man rebelling against God, but of someone in deep despair, overwhelmed by the immensity of his suffering. Job could not understand. How could a man who had always pursued justice, who feared God in all things, be thrown into such calamity? He continued, "Why did I not perish at birth and die as I came from the womb?" It was a sincere confession. He wasn't cursing the Creator, but he was cursing his own origin. Each word was like a breath of pain, finally given voice. Job no longer wanted to continue. He saw no reason. To him, life had lost all meaning. In his speech, he idealizes death as a place of rest, a relief for those who suffer. He speaks of kings, counselors, princes, servants, and captives, all of them resting equally in the grave. There, he says, the wicked cease their troubling, and the weary find rest. Job's pain was so deep that even the stillness of the dead seemed more desirable than the continuation of his days. Why is life given to those in misery, and life to the bitter of soul? Here he goes beyond his personal story. He questions the meaning of human suffering. Why allow someone to be born if their life will be marked only by tears? Why sustain the existence of someone whose only companion is anguish? He didn't know it, but these questions would echo through generations. Because every human being at some point faces the shadows of despair, and Job's words reveal that even the most righteous can fall into anguish. That to feel pain is not a sign of sin, but of humanity. Job ends his speech saying that his sighs are his food and his groans pour out like water. He is consumed by fear, anxiety, and uncertainty. What I feared has come upon me. What I dreaded has happened to me. I have no peace, no quietness. I have no rest, but only turmoil. His cry was the outburst of someone who couldn't understand why all he had feared had now become reality. And though he didn't know it, this moment was necessary, because before God could speak, Job needed to empty his soul. And in that emptiness, the truest parts of him began to emerge. But every word Job spoke made more room for that divine revelation to come. All appearances had to fall away. Only essence could remain, and it was at that moment, after the cry of the soul, that his friends finally rose. For 7 days they had kept silent. But now, feeling ready, or perhaps thinking themselves wise, they began to speak. And what was meant to be comfort became confrontation, and so his friends began to speak. After Job's anguished cry, the 7 days of silence came to an end, and the first to speak was Eliphaz the Temanite. His tone was calm, almost respectful, but his words were loaded with judgment, like an arrow disguised as advice. If someone ventures a word with you, will you be impatient? But who can keep from speaking? Eliphaz began by reminding Job that he had once been a source of guidance and strength for many, that he had taught, corrected, and supported the weary. But now that he was the one afflicted, Job faltered. It was as if he was saying, "You helped others, but can't apply your own advice to yourself." And then came the first accusation, still veiled. Consider now, who, being innocent, has ever perished? Where were the upright ever destroyed? Eliphaz was insinuating that Job had, in some way, sinned. After all, according to his logic, no one suffers without a reason. The doctrine of retribution, the belief that the righteous are always rewarded and the wicked always punished, was the foundation of his argument. He then shared a spiritual vision he had at night, something mysterious and terrifying, claiming that man cannot be righteous before God, that not even angels are pure in the Creator's sight. He puts no trust even in his servants, and he charges his angels with error. With this, he cast guilt upon Job under a cloak of spirituality, as if to say, "Who are you to think you are righteous?" In the next chapter, Eliphaz continues with more advice, now in a harsher tone. He claims that fools suffer because they despise God's correction, that punishment is part of divine discipline. He even prophesies that if Job humbles himself, he will be restored. Blessed is the one whom God corrects, so do not despise the discipline of the Almighty. In other circumstances, such words might sound wise. But for a man who had lost everything without apparent cause, who was covered in sores, sitting in ashes, and who could find no fault in himself, those words were like salt in an open wound. Eliphaz offered no compassion, only judgment. He judged based on appearances, human logic, and what he could see. He didn't understand that Job's suffering was the result of something greater, a divine test that transcended the laws of cause and effect. His words, which should have brought comfort, became spears. Job, already weakened, now had to bear the weight of accusation. The comfort he had hoped for from his friends had turned into an even heavier burden. It was as if on top of all his physical and emotional pain, Job now faced a new kind of suffering, the spiritual pain of being misunderstood. Those who came to comfort him were, in fact, digging his sorrow even deeper. And yet, Job did not lose his voice. He listened to Eliphaz, in silence, but his soul burned within. He knew his suffering was not the result of hidden sin. He knew his heart was upright before God, and for that reason he would not remain silent. Hidden behind the accusations, the misplaced counsel, and the human attempts to explain the unexplainable, Job still had something to say. He would not remain silent. He had something to say. Job listened to everything Eliphaz said, every word, every insinuation, every pious argument laced with judgment. And when he finally opened his mouth, it wasn't with anger, but with pain. A deep pain, mixed with the sorrow of being misunderstood. Oh, that my anguish were weighed, and all my misery be placed on the scales. It would surely outweigh the sand of the seas. He began his outburst by acknowledging the depth of his suffering. He didn't ask for pity, but for understanding. His pain was so heavy, so vast, that he couldn't measure it. And what hurt him most wasn't just the loss, but the fact that his friends, instead of comforting him, had judged him. A despairing man should have the devotion of his friends, even though he forsakes the fear of the Almighty. It was both a reminder and a rebuke. Job was saying plainly that even if he had turned away from God, which he claimed he hadn't, he still deserved compassion. But his friends instead came at him with doctrine, as if his suffering could be solved with religious formulas. He compared their words to the force of a dried-up river, deceiving those who come to drink from it. His hope for comfort had been crushed. Then Job turned to God. He recognized the greatness of the divine, but he also expressed his confusion. What is mankind, that you make so much of them, that you give them so much attention? It wasn't just a question of curiosity, but one of desperation. Why would a God so grand focus so closely on such a small creature? Why monitor every step, allow such suffering, bring so much testing? And then came his most sincere cry, "If I have sinned, what have I done to you, you who see everything we do? Why have you made me your target?" He didn't understand. He never claimed to be perfect, but he saw no guilt in himself that could justify such pain. It was as if he were being struck for reasons unknown to him. His heart was laid bare before God. But Job didn't stop there. He continued his defense, now confronting the logic of his friends with even greater boldness. Indeed, I know that this is true. But how can mere mortals prove their innocence before God? He acknowledged that no one is righteous before God by their own merit. He knew the greatness of the Creator was immeasurable. God could move mountains, blot out the sun, stretch out the heavens, all beyond human comprehension or questioning. And still, Job felt the desperate need to present his case. He longed for someone to stand between him and God, someone to mediate the pain, to make sense of the suffering. If only I knew where to find him, if only I could go to his dwelling. Yet in the midst of the confusion, Job's faith showed signs of astonishing strength, even wounded, even misunderstood, even confused. He trusted. And in one of the most profound moments of his speech, he declared, "Though he slay me, yet will I hope in him." That phrase proved that Job's faith was not driven by reward or protection. He was saying, even if I die by God's own hand, I will still trust him. A faith that doesn't demand explanations, that survives the silence, that endures even without guarantees. But the judgment hadn't ended, and Job knew it. His words fell like stones into still waters, and instead of listening, his friends were readying themselves to strike back. What was meant to be a conversation would become a courtroom, and the evidence would be Job's wounds. And while God's response had not yet come, human suffering dragged on, amid questions, pain, and long speeches. But the judgment of his friends would continue, more cruel with every word. Job's words, though deep and sincere, did not stir compassion. On the contrary, they provoked even harsher reactions. The second friend, Bildad, lacked the tact or moderation of Eliphaz. His approach was blunt, leaving no room for doubt. If Job was suffering so much, it was because he had sinned, and probably his children had too. "How long will you say such things? Your words are a blustering wind." Bildad implied that Job's words were empty and meaningless, like the wind. To him, God does not pervert justice. If Job's children had died, it was because they had sinned. And if Job was now facing misery, the only solution was to seek God sincerely, which, in Bildad's mind, meant repenting of hidden sins. If you are pure and upright, even now he will rouse himself on your behalf and restore you to your prosperous state. Bildad's argument was based on a simple theological logic. God rewards the righteous and punishes the wicked. Therefore, if Job was suffering, it must be his fault, and if he didn't admit it, it was out of pride. Job listened and responded. With sorrow in his soul, he cried out again. He did not deny God's justice, but he saw no guilt in himself worthy of such suffering. And so, once again, he lifted his voice to heaven, not to complain, but to plead, "You know that I'm not guilty, and that no one can rescue me from your hand." He asked why God had formed him so carefully, like a potter shaping clay, only to now crush him. Where was the mercy? Where was the meaning? But before any compassion could arise from his friends, the third one, Zophar, stepped in. And with him, the harshness reached a new level. Zophar was the most aggressive. He said Job talked too much, that his words were empty, and that if God truly treated everyone with exact justice, Job would be getting less than he deserved. Zophar said, Oh, how I wish that God would speak, that he would open his lips against you. Know this: God has even forgotten some of your sin. It was cruel. Zophar not only assumed Job was guilty, but claimed he deserved even greater punishment. And then, like the others, he offered false hope. If Job repented, his life would be restored. But Job had nothing to repent of. He knew his integrity before God. The speeches continued. Eliphaz returned, then Bildad again, and even Zophar repeated his judgments. It became a cycle, an informal courtroom where the three friends took turns condemning the innocent. They quoted old proverbs, personal experiences, popular sayings. They spoke of the fate of the wicked, the prosperity of the righteous, of how God humbles the proud and exalts the humble. And always, always, they insinuated, "Job, you did something, confess it." Their logic was relentless. Suffering is proof of sin, but they were wrong. Their logic did not reach the heavens. Because this test was not punishment. It was purpose. And this story was not about guilt, but about trust. Job, increasingly broken inside, began to distance himself from the arguments of men. He realized he would find neither justice nor compassion in their words, and so he began to cry out for something greater. For I know that my Redeemer lives, and that in the end he will stand upon the earth. It was the voice of a faith that refused to die. In the midst of accusation without mercy, Job lifted his voice with conviction. He believed that someone, the Redeemer, would rise on his behalf. Someone beyond his friend's logic, beyond a religion without compassion, beyond human judgment. It was as if Job were saying, "You do not understand me, but God does, and he will answer." By now, Job no longer expected answers from men. He longed for something that would come from above, something that would break heaven's silence. Job, now weary, began to cry out for something beyond human logic. Job was tired, not just of his body, his wounds, or the painful memory of his lost children. He was exhausted from the empty logic of his friends, from their cold explanations, their judgments disguised as counsel. Tired of their insistence that his suffering was the result of some secret sin. He knew he had walked in integrity, and his conscience remained clean before God. That's why, after another round of accusations, Job raised his voice, but now no longer to men. His cry was directed upward. It wasn't a typical prayer. It was a cry for justice. "Listen carefully to my words. Let this be the consolation you offer me." He was simply asking to be heard, that for once they would silence their conclusions and let him speak. And then Job began to confront the theology of his friends with the reality he saw. Why do the wicked live on, growing old and increasing in power? It was a piercing question. Job looked around and saw wicked men prospering. He saw the unrighteous living in peace, amassing wealth, raising children in safety. They mocked God and still seemed blessed. Their homes were secure, their herds multiplied. So where then was the immediate justice his friends so confidently preached? They say to God, "Leave us alone. We have no desire to know your ways." Even while rejecting the Lord, these men thrived. Job couldn't understand. His life of reverence, of sacrifices, of integrity had been crushed. Yet the wicked, who didn't even acknowledge God's hand, lived in abundance. How could this be explained? The logic of his friends collapsed in the face of the reality Job described. Does God judge every person immediately in this life? Is the wicked always punished? Is the righteous always spared? These questions burned in Job's heart. He wasn't trying to offend. He was trying to understand. It was a cry that didn't come from rebellion, but from a wounded, honest faith that dared to ask because it still believed. Job's faith was different from that of his friends. He wasn't trying to defend God with neat phrases. He wanted to find God. He wanted to speak with him, to look into his eyes if possible and say, "Here I am. Answer me, tell me why. Oh, that I knew where I might find him, that I might come even to his seat." That line is one of the highest expressions of human sincerity before God. Job longed for an encounter. He wanted to present his case before the Lord, like someone standing in a courtroom, not to challenge authority, but to seek clarity. I would state my case before him and fill my mouth with arguments. I would find out what he would answer me and consider what he would say to me. He didn't want to fight. He wanted to understand. The silence of God was what troubled him most. It wasn't just the suffering that hurt. It was the absence of an answer. But if I go to the east, he is not there. If I go to the west, I do not find him. When he is at work in the north, I do not see him. When he turns to the south, I catch no glimpse of him. It was as if God were everywhere and yet nowhere. Job searched for him, but couldn't find him. And yet, even in the whirlwind of pain and confusion, he declared, "But he knows the way that I take. When he has tested me, I will come forth as gold." There it was again, a faith that refused to die. Job didn't understand, but he trusted. He knew he was being tested, and he still believed something good would emerge from it, that his pain had purpose, even if it remained a mystery. He continued, speaking of how wicked men oppress the needy, exploit the weak, hide in darkness. Job saw human injustice and what seemed like divine delay, and that anguished him even more. Why does the Almighty not set times for judgment? Why must those who know him look in vain for such days? Why don't those who walk with God receive clear signs of his justice? Why the silence? Why the waiting? Job still hadn't heard the voice he longed for. His friends continued accusing, and heaven had yet to speak, but the heavens remained silent. God's silence still hung over the story. Job had poured out everything that was in his heart. His friends had confronted him with harsh words, taking turns in speeches that, though filled with wisdom, only sank him deeper. And then the debate stopped. Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar fell silent. They had run out of arguments. They couldn't convince Job, nor did they know how else to accuse him. Job, in turn, no longer listened to them with the same interest. He was exhausted, and it was in that silence, between pain and weariness, that a new voice rose. His name was Elihu. Until then, he had remained quiet. He introduced himself as a young man, younger than the others, and had waited his turn out of respect for the elders. But now, stirred by a holy restlessness, he could no longer remain silent. "I am young in years, and you are old. That is why I was fearful, not daring to tell you what I know." Elihu spoke with humility, but also with conviction. He said that it is the Spirit God places in a person that gives wisdom, not age alone. True understanding comes from the breath of the Almighty. He did not address Job first, but the three friends, and he rebuked them. He said that despite all their many words, they had failed to refute Job. Worse, they sought to condemn him without proof. There is no one among you who refutes Job, yet you condemn him with your words. Then he turned to Job, and with a tone of correction, but not of offense, he began to shed light on something the others had not considered, that suffering may serve purposes beyond punishment. Why do you complain to him that he responds to no one's words? Elihu suggested that God does indeed speak to man, through dreams, visions, even physical pain, but not always in the way we expect. Sometimes suffering is a form of discipline, redirection, or preservation of the soul. For God does speak, now one way, now another, though no one perceives it. He did not claim that Job had committed great sin, as the others had. But he warned God is just. If he allows pain, it is not without purpose. It may be to prevent something worse, to teach, to reveal something deeper. Suffering, then, was no longer punishment, but a process. Elihu exalted God's greatness. He declared that God is perfect in knowledge, just in all his ways, and that no one can judge him. But he also reminded them that God does not despise man. He desires good even when he corrects. God is mighty, but despises no one. He is mighty and firm in his purpose. Elihu tried to show that God is not indifferent to human pain, that he is sovereign, yes, but also attentive, that Job's suffering was not abandonment, but perhaps an invitation to a greater revelation. How great is God, beyond our understanding. The number of his years is past finding out. Throughout his speeches, Elihu used creation as illustration. He spoke of clouds, thunder, rain. He pointed to the heavens and said, "Look at the greatness. Look at the mysteries. Look at how man does not understand, yet lives beneath these wonders every day." It was as if he were saying, Job, maybe God won't explain everything right now, but he is at work. Even if you don't understand, trust him. Elihu didn't offer exact answers, but he offered something new, hope with reverence, and humility with confidence. His words didn't wound, they awakened. They were firm, but not cruel, direct, but not humiliating. Unlike the others, Elihu wasn't trying to prove anything. He was pointing to God, not as a judge, but as a teacher. And then, at the end of his speech, he exclaimed, "The Almighty is beyond our reach and exalted in power. In his justice and great righteousness, he does not oppress." He ended with reverence, placing God in his rightful place as absolute, as sovereign, but also inviting Job to recognize him as the one beyond human understanding. The air felt heavy. Elihu's words lingered like the prelude to something great. Heaven was still silent, but not for long, because thereafter, the young man's voice, when the last human argument had faded, came the whirlwind, and when it ended, the whirlwind had come. The sky was heavy. After long chapters of pain, accusations, and desperate searches for answers, the silence was finally broken. Not by another human opinion, not by a new theological argument, but by something no one expected. A storm, a whirlwind, began to form on the horizon. It was no ordinary gust of wind. There was power, there was glory, there was awe in that movement of the heavens. Nature seemed to awaken before the invisible presence of the Creator. Lightning split the sky, the wind howled among the rocks, and the ground trembled beneath the feet of men. And then God spoke. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind. The words of the Most High came from the heart of the storm. It was as if the universe itself bowed to the voice of its creator. There was no longer room for theory, speculation, or debate. Now, God himself took center stage. But what he said was unexpected. He did not begin with comfort, nor with explanations. He did not justify Job's suffering, nor reveal the behind-the-scenes of the heavenly challenge. Instead, God asked a question. Who is this that obscures my counsel with words without knowledge? It was not an angry rebuke, but a firm correction. God was not saying that Job had sinned, but that his perspective was limited. He spoke with the voice of one who sees the whole, while men see only fragments. Brace yourself like a man. I will question you, and you shall answer me. From that moment, a series of questions fell upon Job, like a torrential downpour of wisdom. But they weren't questions seeking answers. They were questions meant to reveal divine greatness and human smallness. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand. Each word came with the weight of creation. God asked about the dimensions of the earth, the foundations of the world, the boundaries of the sea. He spoke of the dawn, the depths of the ocean, the place where light is separated from darkness. Have you journeyed to the springs of the sea, or walked in the recesses of the deep? It was as if the Creator were drawing back the veil of existence, inviting Job and all of us to look not at the pain of life, but at the majesty that upholds everything. God spoke of the storehouses of snow, the constellations, the laws of the heavens. Name by name, image by image, he exalted his own work, not out of pride, but to awaken reverence. He spoke of rain that falls in the desert where no man lives, of the raven that cries for food, of the mountain goat giving birth, of the wild ox that refuses to be tamed, of the ostrich that forgets her eggs on the ground, of the horse that neighs in battle, of the hawk that soars high in the sky. Every detail of the universe was recalled, and each one carried a message. Do you know these things, Job? Do you understand how it all works? It was not humiliation, it was revelation. God didn't answer Job's questions with explanations. He answered with presence. He didn't tell Job why he was suffering. He showed Job who he is. And in doing so, the very weight of pain began to shift. Because in the immensity of the Almighty, even suffering changes its place. Not because it stops hurting, but because it becomes enveloped in something greater. Divine majesty. Job had heard many voices. The voices of his friends were full of judgment. Elihu's voice was full of conviction, but the voice from the whirlwind was full of glory. Word by word, the Creator painted with questions a new vision of the world, of mankind, of faith. There, among thunder and wisdom, Job did not receive explanations. He received something greater, the revelation that God is in control, even when everything seems to fall apart. That faith doesn't need answers, it needs surrender. The whirlwind spun around Job, but inside him, something was beginning to grow still. The storm still roared. God's words continued to echo from the whirlwind, but now it was no longer merely a display of power. It was a revelation. What was being said to Job was more than a simple answer to his questions. It was an invitation to behold something infinitely greater, Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? That question was only the beginning. From there, God unfolded a majestic procession of rhetorical questions, all designed to lead Job to a single place: humility before the glory of God. God did not reveal to Job the conversation with Satan, nor explain why he had allowed such suffering. He said nothing of tests, nor of heavenly secrets. But he did reveal what Job needed most to see: God himself. He spoke of the constellations, the commands of heaven, the cycle of rain, dew, and frost. He pointed to the behavior of animals: the lion, the raven, the mountain goat, the wild donkey, the wild ox, the ostrich, the horse, the hawk, the crocodile. Each creature, with its habits and mysteries, served to show something greater. God is in everything, and everything is under his control. Who has put wisdom in the inward parts? Or who has given understanding to the heart? It was as if the Creator was saying, Job, you don't need to understand everything. You just need to trust me. The never-revealed secret of Job, what God said to him in the whirlwind, was exactly this: not an explanation, but a revelation. God owes no man a report of his ways, because he is God, sovereign, perfect, infinite, and we are clay in his hands. But what makes this secret so special is that it doesn't humiliate. It transforms. It doesn't put man beneath God simply to crush him, but to place him in his rightful position, where he can see more clearly, with reverence and trust. Job stood before something no other man had experienced in quite that way: a conversation with the Almighty. Not to be answered, but to be shaped. God continued, "Shall the one who contends with the Almighty correct him?" Finally, Job begins to respond. But his words are different now. There is no more defense, no more demand for justice. The man who once cried out for explanations now stands in silence. "Behold, I am vile. What shall I answer you? I lay my hand over my mouth." Job was beginning to understand. His pain was still real. The losses were still present. But something within him had changed. He no longer needed to know the reason for everything, because now he knew who God was. But God wasn't finished yet. He continued, describing the strength of Behemoth and the ferocity of Leviathan, grand, powerful, fearsome creatures man cannot control, yet they live under the watchful eye of their Creator. His breath kindles coals, and a flame comes out of his mouth. In the end, the message was clear. If Job could not control or comprehend these creatures, how could he judge the ways of God? Job had shouted, pleaded, questioned, and God responded, not with justifications, but with presence. The climax of this story is not a logical explanation, but an inner transformation. The secret that had never been revealed was this: God does not need to be explained. He needs to be revered. And true faith is the kind that bows, even when it doesn't understand. Job's faith had been pushed to the edge. He had lost everything, been wounded in body, crushed in soul, judged by friends. And now, surrounded by the whirlwind, he found not the end of pain, but the beginning of a new vision. The never-revealed secret of Job. What God said to him in the whirlwind was that man does not live by answers, but by trust. And Before the majesty of God, even suffering finds its place. But what would Job say at the end of it all? The storm had passed. The whirlwind that had carried the voice of God now gave way to a different kind of silence. It was not the silence of absence, but of reverence. A silence full of meaning, where words were no longer necessary because the heart understood. Job, who had spoken so much, now simply bows. No more defenses, no more justifications, not even lamentations, only acknowledgement. I know that you can do everything, and that no purpose of yours can be thwarted. Job 42.2. Job's first words after hearing the Creator are a powerful testimony. He no longer speaks as a wounded man, but as one restored from within. His pain had not disappeared, it was still there, but now it dwelled in a heart shaped by something greater than human logic, the presence of God. I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eyes see you. These words carry the essence of the entire story. Job, the upright, faithful, worshipping man, now knew God in a completely new way. He no longer knew him only through rituals, blessings, or tradition. He had seen God, not with physical eyes, but with the eyes of the Spirit, with a heart awakened by revelation. This is the greatest transformation of all, to see God in the midst of pain. Job acknowledges his limitations. He admits he spoke of what he didn't understand, questioned without knowledge, and now he repents. Not a repentance for moral sin, but for trying to measure God with a human ruler. Therefore I abhor myself and repent in dust and ashes. There, in the same dust and ashes where he once sat in mourning and pain, he now repents, not for weeping, but for demanding to understand what is mystery. And it is at this moment of deep surrender and humility that restoration begins. God then turns to Job's friends. Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar had spoken arrogantly, attributing to Job guilt he did not have. And God rebukes them. My wrath is aroused against you and your two friends, for you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has. Remarkably, God defends Job. Even after all that happened, even after the complaints and questions, the Lord affirms that Job spoke sincerely. His pain was real, his heart was honest, and that to God is more valuable than correct speeches empty of compassion. Then God commands the friends to offer sacrifices, but that alone is not enough. They would need Job to pray for them. Yes, the one who was unjustly accused now becomes the intercessor for those who wounded him with their words. My servant Job shall pray for you, for I will accept him. And Job, in his humility, prays for them. This scene is as powerful as the whirlwind. The man once wounded now heals. The one who suffered in silence now intercedes in mercy. And it is in this moment, when Job prays for those who hurt him, that something wonderful happens. And the Lord restored Job's fortunes when he prayed for his friends. God reversed the captivity. He changed the scene. He altered the destiny, and not only restored Job, but blessed him doubly. Everything Job had lost, and flocks, riches, dignity, was returned and multiplied. He had more children, lived many more years, and saw 4 generations of his descendants. But, more important than all of this, he saw God. The never-revealed secret of Job. What God said to him in the whirlwind was not an explanation. It was an encounter. Job's pain was the path to something far greater, the revelation of God's character, his sovereignty, and the beauty of a faith that endures even without answers. Job was restored outwardly, but before that he was transformed inwardly. He didn't just get back what he had lost, he gained a new dimension of faith. The story ends in peace, but it is a different peace than at the beginning. There, Job was upright and prosperous. Here he is upright and broken. There he had heard of God. Here he knows him by sight. And that is the greatest reward anyone could ever receive. We have reached the end of Job's journey, one of the most moving, mysterious, and transformative stories in all of Scripture. A path marked by devastating loss, divine silence, deep questioning, and ultimately, an unshakable encounter with the God who speaks from the whirlwind. What do we carry with us as we close our eyes and remember everything Job endured? We carry the certainty that true faith does not demand all the answers. Yes, Job wanted to understand. He cried out for explanations. He felt lost, wronged, misunderstood. And God did not condemn him for that. God listened, and in the right time, he responded, not with justifications, but with his presence. The greatest revelation was not a why, it was a who. The never-revealed secret of Job, what God said to him in the whirlwind, was not a divine formula or spiritual code. It was the recognition that God remains God, even when the ground vanishes beneath our feet, even when his voice seems silent. Job teaches us that suffering doesn't always make sense. It doesn't always have a visible cause, but it is never beyond God's reach. There is a greater purpose, even if hidden. And sometimes the very process of pain becomes the stage where faith is refined. We see this when Job, in the height of his misery, still worshipped. When he tore his garments, poured ashes over his head and declared, "The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." We see this when, even wounded inside and out, he refused to curse his Creator. Shall we accept good from God and not accept adversity? We see this when, even after being confronted, he prayed for his friends, and it was in that prayer that restoration began. Ultimately, we see that Job's greatest victory was not material restoration. It was inner transformation, humility before glory, reverence before mystery. And this is the lesson that remains for you and me. When everything seems to fall apart, God is still in control. When heaven is silent, he still sees us. When the whirlwind swirls, it is there, inside it, that he speaks. The secret of Job was never hidden. It was being revealed chapter by chapter, tear by tear, until, at the peak of his pain, God showed that what matters most is not understanding, it is trusting. And when we trust, even without explanations, even without answers, the whirlwind ceases to be a symbol of chaos and becomes the place where the voice of God finds us. Just like Job, maybe you are in the middle of loss, doubt, or long silences. But remember, God still speaks, God still reigns, God still restores, and even in the whirlwind, he is present. If you were touched by this story, 2 more videos will appear on your screen featuring biblical characters who also faced deserts and divine revelations. Click to watch, subscribe to the channel, and leave a like. May God speak to you, even if it's from the midst of the whirlwind.